I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. So up until now, we've really been following the evidence. We've been gathering, accumulating, aggregating evidence, cell phone evidence, telematics, CCTV, texts, to some extent social media. And now what we want to do is look at statements and see to what extent the statements match the evidence that we've gathered. We want to follow the evidence and then we want to check and cross-reference these statements. And so we're now going to start with Barry's first statement, which he gave on May 13th. And it was quite a long statement. What he said to Suzanne's father, Gene, was that he'd spoken to police for 5 hours. And that's presumably a reference to the May 13th interview. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. I will be dealing with more of Barry's statements, but also juxtaposing those with statements from other folk. So we've got quite a lot to work through. Also bear in mind, I know I said I would do a live stream on the Ramsey case yesterday, but anyway, I'm going to be trying to do that tonight. So we'll see how that goes. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button and let's get started. So the first comment I want to highlight, which is also highlighted in the affidavit, Barry said, I just know that there's nothing in my truck. There's nothing in my house. I know that for a fact. Unless somebody came there Sunday morning after I left. That's all. I'm just being honest with you. They can be there for 10 weeks. They'll never find a single thing. But Barry then interjected that Cody Cox, as a suspect, that Cody allegedly threatened to kill Barry. Barry consistently throughout the interview questioned why he had not been cleared in the investigation. But I do want to deal with a statement that he makes, where he says, I know there's nothing in my truck. There's nothing in my house. That reminds me of what Chris Watts said during his sermon on the porch. Remember this?
And that's when I came home and then walked in the house and nothing was vanished. Nothing was here. I mean, she wasn't here. The kids weren't here. Nobody was here.
Now, it may be possible to say we're listening to that out of context, but he doesn't seem to be thinking of Suzanne anymore as a person in terms of the statement, but rather about what evidence might be left behind, what evidence might be found of her, just as Chris Watts did. In fact, when Chris Watts said nothing was here, he corrected himself a moment later to say, she wasn't here. The kids weren't here. Let's listen to that again.
And then walked in the house and nothing was vanished. Nothing was here. I mean, she wasn't here. The kids weren't here. Nobody was here.
But can you see by saying nothing is there and there's nothing in my truck, there's nothing in my house, you're tending to think about it in terms of evidence, right? Not as a person. So what are we dealing with? Where are we? Well, we're on page 21 of the affidavit, which highlights several standout statements Barry made during this extensive, 5 hours of questioning on Wednesday, May 13th. Basically just 3 or 4 days since Suzanne disappeared. 5 days after that, they spoke to Gene, Suzanne's father, and we'll be dealing with that interview later on in this series. So when Barry was asked who he thought might be suspicious, Barry initially identified the Cushman's cleaning lady's daughter and boyfriend as possible suspicious persons. That reminds me a bit of the Ramseys eyeing their help, their housekeeper. Barry stated, because if somebody went in and did something and took her and then ditched her bike to make it look like something, then I want you guys to find that evidence. However, he states multiple times, there's nothing in the house, nothing in my truck. That's on page 21. Just this repetition of there's nothing in the house, nothing in my truck. Barry also said she would get so angry sometimes and even hateful, which is not her. Barry stated during these arguments, Suzanne stated, I'm going to leave you, I'm going to divorce you. But she doesn't mean it. I know she doesn't mean it, but she's in that state of mind. And so I think he's saying something quite significant when he says it's not her. And if you think about it, she had turned a corner around about the time of the event, around about the 6th of May. Suzanne had kind of made a decision and thought she had a second chance in life. And so him saying this was not her is actually a truthful statement, except you can see he's taking it in kind of a negative light. Then when asked about working on Sunday, he stated, it's Mother's Day, it's not like it's Husband Day. He stated he stayed at the worksite with a quote, I think I was there until probably 6, meaning 6 p.m. Now, if we go through this, it's interesting how in the first interview, Barry put forward several suspects, and yet his defense case would later be that Suzanne simply left on her own, that there were no suspects, that they were waiting for her to change her mind and return home. But who runs away on a bicycle when they have a car? Note the affidavit also repeats that Barry said several times, there's nothing in the house, nothing in my truck. It's an interesting thing to emphasize, and Barry seems quite certain of that. Why is that so? Why is he so certain? Why is Chris Watts as certain as he is? Now, in terms of his reference to the work site, he said he was there until 6 p.m., but digital data from Barry's cell phone, you guys should know this. If you've been paying attention to the series, that should have stood out to you. That is not a match, because it shows Barry was at the worksite for barely half an hour, from 11:57 a.m. to 12:25 p.m., and that he was back at the hotel in the hotel parking lot at 12:28. We also know that he stayed in his room for the next approximately 5 hours. And so it's going to be interesting to see what he says about that day. Does he create the impression that he was working on that Sunday, that he was at the work site for most of that day? Well, him saying, I think I was there until probably 6, implies he was at the work site, right, for that period. Anyway, now let's go to another section from the affidavit. In regards to the calls to Jean Ritter, he stated, she calls me and says, hey, her car is here. And I said, well, is her bike there? She goes, where does she keep the bike? And I said, well, I pulled out her car. It should be right near the car. She goes, there's no bike here. Look here in the back. And I said, well, she's riding a bike, but I'm a little concerned because I think she was going to take a morning ride. And we need to deal with that aspect. Why does he think she would have taken a morning ride? Then in regards to inspecting the clothing, Barry said, yeah, she doesn't ride without a helmet, and she has a light blue helmet. Her favorite biking outfit is blue. I haven't been to the house to see if it's there or not, but if you guys didn't find it, then that's probably what she was wearing. Was the blue one missing? Light blue helmet, light blue outfit. She's a matcher. Light blue shirt. Was that in her closet, or did you find it? So can you see he seems quite focused on her cycling clothing. And so it is quite interesting whether she was found in that clothing and also what happened to that clothing ultimately. Regarding the bedding, Barry stated that he observed sheets in the dryer. He stated, was her whole bed blank? Because I wasn't in blank's room. Was the whole bedding off? Now, it's quite interesting that I always say one of the things to look out for in the middle of a crime is someone doing the laundry. And so you also have something quite unusual here, is in the middle of Suzanne disappearing, the bedding goes into the dryer. And so it almost feels like something happens in the Morphew home, and the next thing you see Barry carrying clothes into the hotel room. Do you notice that? Dribs and drabs of clothing, a shirt here, boots there, and something that you can't quite make out here and there. Anyway, Barry was asked to voluntarily submit to a polygraph examination, which he declined and said he would think about. He said he didn't want to do anything that wasn't 100% accurate. He also said they weren't admissible in court. Now, this is why I say I think the intertextuality was still at the top of Barry's mind in terms of Chris Watts, because do you remember what gave Chris Watts away was basically him doing the lie detector test. And Chris Watts admitted it. Chris Watts said when he did it, his mind was being turned into Swiss cheese. And but you can actually see how the whole Chris Watts case basically, the breakthrough came around that polygraph. And so was Barry aware of that and now learns the lesson from that? I think it's very hard not to think about that. And then Agent Cale observed scratches on Barry's left upper arm. And now Barry's actually asked about that. And so Barry said, yeah, like that from a tree when we were hiking in the mountains. And this is also mentioned in the affidavit, these injuries appear to be healing. They seem to be several days old scratches. So it's quite an interesting comment that he makes, that the scratches that he has on his left upper arm are from a tree, from something that can have fairly sharp edges to it. And so he seems to be acknowledging that it's something that is certainly of a similar edge to potentially something like a fingernail. And I would like to hear the interview, but it would be good to know when he said, well, when we were hiking in the mountains, what day was he referring to? And I remember in terms of the text messages that were sent between Barry and Suzanne, he apparently said to her something about, do you want to go hiking? And wasn't that on the Saturday? So he's actually saying that he may have cut his arm on a tree while hiking, I guess, with Suzanne on that Saturday, right? And that's the version that he gives. Now, the other thing that's interesting is, so in other words, either he did cut himself with a tree and he was hiking, or something else happened, right? In other words, the tree thing is a symbol for something else. Then if you think about it in a similar way, is the mountain lion also a symbol for what actually happened to Suzanne? But what I mean is, it's not a random symbol, it's actually quite specific, that something severe happened to her, and it's actually giving you more information than you perhaps realize. Another observation, Barry's certainty about looking for Suzanne's bike is interesting. You would imagine the focus would initially be on whether she's answering her phone, and it probably was. Barry also says that Suzanne went out for a morning ride, and yet her brother would say that Suzanne was a late sleeper and tended to ride in the afternoon. If we go to another section of the affidavit, Andrew did not know Suzanne to have ever been an early riser. Also, we know when Suzanne texted Barry previously, it was to ride in the afternoon. On May 7th, 2 or 3 days before the incident, at 4:43 p.m., Suzanne messaged Barry, been studying all afternoon. I'm going to bike now. I've got veggie soup on for supper. Then also all of Suzanne's Instagrams about her mountain biking were also posted in the afternoon, right? On the 6th of May, 4:30 p.m. with a location Little Rainbow Trail. The 27th of April, 4:36 p.m. location Mount Chavano. The 20th of April, 2:18 p.m. So you have at least 3 mountain bike events that seem to take place around about 4:30, and then another one that takes place at 2:18 p.m. And that was with the location of Methodist Mountain and the captions first single track. So I'm not going to take it further than that. We will deal with this interview on the 13th in more detail, and as I say, we're going to cross-reference some of these interviews with other interviews. I must also apologize. I'm not syncing everything I say to images. It can sometimes add 3 or 4 or more hours to a simple episode. So I hope you can excuse me for that. Obviously, if you express your appreciation for videos that are synced, then, it's worth my while to spend a bit more time on that. So I'm not going to take it further than that. We will continue with this series specifically dealing with Barry's interviews. I am hoping to put up another video, basically do a live stream dealing with the Ramsey statements. And I do promise the audio on that has definitely been boosted. So look out for that a little bit later today. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.